Welcome to Nonfiction Book Review Report for Fooled by Randomness by Nassim Taleb. The idea behind my nonfiction book review reports is for me to provide you with a general idea of what the book is about, discuss some of the major points, and provide my opinion on those points and on the book overall. I will not be going into detail of every single thing that is in the book, as that to me would be like conducting pretty much an audit of the book. Rather, I just like to do just a general review of it. Now, let's move on to the most important part about the book, and that's the author. In this case, his author is Nassim Taleb. He comes from a prominent Lebanese family that was a politically connected family in Lebanon. He has education that's focused on business and finance. He has a PhD in management sciences. He's also classically educated because he went to a type of I guess a elite type of school back in Lebanon. So throughout the book, he will make references to the Greek philosophers. He will make references to historical events that usually you do not see in a normal financial text type of books, because usually people who write them do not have that kind of background to talk about philosophy or ancient or even medieval history or history of Renaissance period as such. Finally, the author also has an extensive experience in financial markets and trading. He was a trader, participated in financial markets, he managed his own investment funds, he started his own investment company. So therefore, he can be very much qualified to talk about finance, and this is what the book is about. Because I also have financial education, I can discuss the book much more in detail, or go and discuss his arguments in much bigger detail, because I can understand and can critique some of his views thanks to my education. So let's talk about the book. The book, I would say, is a bit wordy, but has a very interesting stories and anecdotes to illustrate its points. But they do get very wordy, and sometimes I feel like they could have cut down on that part a bit, or made those anecdotes shorter. The book also has the notes and references included in it at the back of it. However, they're not explicitly included in the text itself. The reason for that, as the author makes it very clear in the introduction, is that he was not looking to make an academic textbook, but rather something that would be more accessible to everyday person. Therefore, he did not want to create something that looked like a textbook, and that's why he is not making notes in the book as explicit as you would usually find in the modern text. Well, non-fiction text. So let's move on to the major points. And the first and major points that the author always stresses is the idea of randomness. His idea is that random events are much more likely to appear than people believe them to be. In this case, he actually means not just any normal events. He means with regards to finance, with regards to ideas that events that will radically move the markets, different crises or different things that will improve, let's say, the market performance that beyond what is really expected. And his major point is that these events are more likely than anybody predicts in finance. Now, what you can say is that, sorry, but I'm actually coming from a cold, so you might hear my voice a bit being, well, unpleasant because of that. So basically, when we're looking at any type of probabilities and thinking about them, usually people think of a standard normal distribution. That's what you see on the graph below the text in red. At least that's what I tried to simulate in Excel. That was done to my best ability. That normal distribution is clustered around the mean, and you have the tails, as you can see, the ones that the lines that all the way go down to 4 and -4. Those are the tails. That means the more extreme events are least likely to occur. Now, usually tails do not touch the bottom of the graph; they keep on going. Now, the author himself believes, I guess, that since those extreme events are more likely to happen, then this is what we call a fat tail distribution. And what you see that in the graph in blue, where the tails of the graph that go to 4 and -4 are much more higher, and therefore the probability of events is much more higher. Well, that would also mean that the probability of the events around the mean are much lower. So from that point perspective, I would say that's how can you kind of illustrate the author's point, and what you need to keep in mind when thinking about all his major points, since they all will be coming from randomness. Now, further onto randomness. As I said, because author believes in that there's a lot of randomness overall in the markets and overall in life, events are usually a result of randomness, and not there's no particular cause and effect. It's pretty much he believes it's our human need to have cause and effect, that we build a story to explain why the events happen, even though they just were randomly occurring. At the same time, since events are randomly occurring, it's pretty much saying that you cannot use anything to predict future events because they're random. How can you know that the crash will occur? Can't, because it's random. It will not be, won't be able to predict. And the reason for that is that most of the crashes, most of the stuff, well, he actually says all of them basically, happen because they happen and we can't predict them because they never happened before. So we don't know the probability of their occurrence, the real probability. What happens after the fact is that people build a story to say this was the result and why it happened. Now, from my point of view, I would disagree with the whole idea that everything is there's so much randomness in anything. There's always causes for everything. But I guess there's so many factors that usually cause different things to occur that it's very difficult to unravel the actual true reasons for any event. That at that point, it's possible to say that, well, I might as well just assume that the events were random because we can't really get to the bottom of the actual causes. But there has to be some kind of causes. So let's say if the market is going down, and he kind of says that usually markets day to day go up and down. Well, if the markets are going up or down, must be a cause for that. And he says, no, it's all randomness, but there must be a cause why somebody thinks that they can sell one day's their securities higher and or sells their securities lower on some day. Why do they decide that to do that? Because generally markets is just the movement of markets is just a sum of movements of all the securities. Somebody has to decide why they want to sell something at a higher price or at lower price, and somebody will be deciding why they want to buy something at higher price and at lower price. There has to be a reason, and that's your causes. It's just there's going to be a lot of those securities, there's a lot of reasons, and there's a lot of causes. The next major point is survivorship bias, and now he kind of explains it differently from one I learned from about it when I was doing my financial education. For usually because survivorship bias's idea is that when you present performance of investments, you will have survivorship bias if you remove any investments that did badly from your portfolio. So in other words, when you present your portfolio, you say, well, I invested this much in these 5 stocks and look where they went. Well, in reality, you actually invested, let's say, in 10 stocks, but because the other 5 went down and you sold them off, you don't present their performance. That's why you kind of overestimate your overall performance of your portfolio because you're just keeping the 5 and using their performance to average and saying that this is your average performance. But in reality, your performance should include the stocks that did badly. Now, in his idea, he's presenting it different. He's saying that people who we see as successful, when we look at them, we're exhibiting survivorship bias because we're not looking at all the other people who are not successful, who done same things, let's say, as successful people, but because of randomness of life or events and markets, successful people became successful due to that. That's his argument, that it's random events that led to their success, while we don't see the people who did not have the same luck, and we do not factor that in when we're evaluating why somebody is so successful. So that comes in with the whole idea that maybe these successful people have a strategy for what they have to be doing, but that strategy could be just a result of pure luck that fit into the actual market movements, and therefore they're able to make their profits Then eventually regression to the mean happens, and that all the successful people will suffer losses because statistically you always have your distribution that there's always also the chances of the mean is always higher than the chances of the extreme events, and therefore eventually things have to balance out, and you will go from very successful to less successful in order to balance out and go back into the mean. That's one of his points. The other one is the idea behind the data mining, and this kind of ties in with survivorship bias. And what his point is that when you have a lot of data, you can uncover a lot of patterns in any data, and this is a very well known statistical problem. The idea that when you have a large statistical data set, you can find a lot of stuff. So him is saying that, well, yeah, if you have this much data, you can find patterns, but doesn't mean that any of those patterns are actually real and not just randomness. As he says, random series of events don't need to look random to be random. In other words, just the actual randomness itself might generate a pattern, but that will not hold beyond just this data series. As soon as you expand the data, as soon as you start moving forward in the future, this pattern will not hold because it actually was not there. That again, why? Because all events and everything is happening randomly, or at least randomness of the events is very high. Now let's all move on. Since all these problems with data mining, survivorship bias, he points out that the models that are used to model financial performance, that are used by financial professionals, are not any good because they can't really model the real world, as events are non-linear in the real world, so linear models will not work. And generally, because there's so much randomness in the financial markets, you can't seriously kind of a model all that in. And therefore, he believes that eventually all models will fail because they are based on historical data, but history can't predict the future because the future is random, and the events and their probabilities that they will happen cannot be factored back in because they haven't happened yet, and we do not have those probabilities to use in our models. Therefore, the models cannot be used to predict the future. Now, like the say, the last part of the book, he really focuses why he kind of tried to rely on all these models, all this stuff, and the reason he says is because we as humans don't understand the whole idea of probability, or we can't really understand statistics when they present to that. Yes, we can see them, but we can't really deal with them. That's a problem. In other words, we can't really get the kind of work with them in our head because as human beings, we have not evolved to use all that stuff. As a result, you will kind of have people who kind of are unable to understand that certain events are supposed to be more likely or less likely. His examples include people who I won't say that his example, but example of that would be that similar to, I guess, some stuff that he talks about, is offering a person who lives in a fault line insurance for natural calamities. The person saying, no, I don't need that. Then offering them insurance for earthquakes, and they'll say, yes, that's more likely to happen, so therefore I'm going to take it. But is that earthquake a natural calamity? Well, yes, but the person does not really sees it that way. They see the earthquake more likely than the natural calamity because they live on a fault line, because the earthquake is much more recallable in their memory. Same thing, people are unable to really understand conditional probability. The conditional probability is pretty much is that you have an event A, and probability of that event you examine, given that, let's say, event B has occurred. That's a conditional probability. Conditional probability that A will occur given that event B has occurred. And he points out through his examples that, again, as a people, we would usually add probabilities of A and B together. So if B has occurred, we think that A is then more likely, even though it's not. because technically speaking, conditional probabilities are actually multiplication of probabilities. Therefore, the occurrence of event A given B is much more lower than it appears to be. But as human beings, we won't be able to kind of process that in our head. More likely to add the two events together. Now, finally, he also talks about the idea how the statistical data is presented matters to us. So let's say a person who got a terminal illness, or not a terminal illness, because terminal illness, that means the person will die, but an illness, and given the odds of survival to be 70%, so the person will be actually feeling much better about it, rather than if the person is given the odds of death at 30%, even though it's the same statistic. It's just a flip side of each other. But the way it's presented to us will matter to our internal understanding, and then how we would kind of process the statistics. So it's a whole idea of a glass half empty, half full. Is matters here. Depending the way you present it, people will react the same way. Finally, he talks about something, the concept called satisficing. Now, when I was studying the concept of satisficing, which basically is based on the idea that you take two words, satisfy and suffice, and put them together to create this concept. The concept when I was studying was the idea is that as human beings, we have limited time and limited resources to look over all possible outcomes. Therefore, we can't do so. Therefore, we'll choose to limit our search of all the possible outcomes and probabilities of them to certain kind of section of that universe of those possibilities. And we're gonna say that this satisfies us because it's sufficient enough for our decision making. That's satisficing. His idea is that our brain just does it for us because our brain can't process this much information, so it will apply type of a rules of thumb, some other rules to literally limit itself and say, well, these are only the things that we're gonna look at. These are the only things that our brain will decide to process different occurrences and probabilities, and to a certain extent, and say this is what you need to do. Quite often using type of rules of thumb to decide on something rather than working through the whole process of probabilities and a likeliness of events occurring. Now, one of his more of a final points is that we all get fooled by randomness. Even he makes few examples of that in his book. And the idea is that nobody is perfect. We all, because, as he points out, as humans we can't deal with probabilities properly, we'll be fooled by randomness, and will attribute the correlation of events to causation. The most extreme example is that the one that he uses in the book is the one with the pigeons, and the idea was that the research scientists had created a button for the pigeons to press, and when they press the button, the food will come out. But except that the research scientists made it so that the pressing of the button does not always give the pigeons the food. It's actually very random. Therefore, pigeons don't know if they press a button if they're going to get the food. The result was that the pigeons started to perform this kind of movement, so type of a dance or do something, because they started attributing something that they did before they pressed the button as part of the causation why they were getting food. And that's another example of being fooled by randomness. So finally, and I guess it's not much of a major point, but people would ask and say, well, if everything is random, if all the markets are random, how's this guy who's so educated in finance, who used to be a trader, who started his own investment company, how did he do it then? If he does not believe he can predict the future, how would you invest then? Well, his investments are not based in stocks. He does not invest in stocks. He uses bonds, and the reason for that, of course, is because he uses a lot of hedge instruments. He uses a lot of derivatives, and for that, you need margin, and usually that margin are bonds, government bonds, and that's what he uses. His investments, not in derivatives. And what he does is that he hedges himself against those extreme events of markets, of movements in the market, to make sure that he's not kind of affected by this large crisis, but actually gains from them. So year to year, while the markets are performing normally, don't have that crisis, he's losing money because he's constantly buying these derivatives. He's paying premiums for buying those derivatives, and he's constantly losing money. But then he has extreme gains whenever one of those crashes happen. That covers all his previous losses and provides the actual result. Let's say overall result, the high result that he experiences. Or the higher performance that he experiences. Kind of interesting the fact that he says you can't use past to predict the future, but he kind of uses the fact that in the past people could not predict this event, so they could not really price them into the price of the securities of the markets and the price of derivatives. Uses that knowledge of the fact, the historical knowledge, to predict that in the future people won't be able to do it, and that there will be future crises and crashes in the market for him to take advantage of it. So it's kind of goes against the whole idea that you can't use future to predict. So you can't use past to predict the future, as he was saying before, because you don't know the likelihood of it. But his strategy is to sit there and wait for it to happen, basically. There's a problem with that strategy, especially is, let's say if you need the money, you're investing the money for 5 years, and you're saying, well, I want my money to earn certain income in 5 years, but this extreme market event does not happen, you don't earn any money. Well, use of it. This strategy, right? The strategy only works for a very long duration of period of time. So the final conclusion on the book. Well, this is a very easy to read book. It's a bit too long though. As I mentioned before, there's just slightly too much of stories and anecdotes, and I would love to if he would have summarized them a bit more rather than go through that much of information of those stories, because he kind of most of his stories are examples of things. They're not really based on real people. Some of them he says are based on real people, but he's changed their names so that you can't recognize them. But still, overall, this is just general stories, and I quite often was when I was reading, I was hoping that he can get on with the story quicker, so I can get to the major points that he's trying to make. Now, if you're a person who studied finance, specifically behavioral finance, you will not find anything really new in this book. Just slightly different approach to how some of the biases and cognitive errors that identify with behavioral finance are explained here. They actually maybe name slightly different, but that's something that I found to be with all the behavioral finance literature. They name the biases and cognitive errors differently sometimes. But overall, you're not gonna find anything new in this book. This book is for people who have not studied behavioral finance. Alright? Thank you for listening. Goodbye.